Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Lamed Daled. We're going to start at the very bottom. I'm just going to review what we did in the last class. We saw about Arava Gzula. We were talking now about the willow branch that we use in the Sukkah. And we have, the usual stolen dry, Asher Irani Dachad, if it gets the top of it gets cut off, if the leaves split. Then we talked about the Saftsifa, which we're going to see today. Then we had Kmusha, if it dries up a little bit, Nashru Miktsat Alav, the leaves start falling off, or Shalba'al, if it's part of an irrigated field, then it's Kshera. A non-irrigated field, a field that doesn't need irrigation. Tanu Rabbanan, then we started seeing Brightot that started darshaning the words Arvei Nachal. So it says in the verse Arvei Nachal. So from there we learn Hagdelim ala Nachal. First thing we learned, it has to grow by a brook. Then we said Davar Acher, another explanation, Arvei Nachal she'aleh shela mashuch kenachal, that its leaves are long, elongated like a brook. Tanya Idach, another bright, Arvei Nachal, Arvei Nachal, Shabal v'shel harim minayim. This one includes others. How does it include whether it grows in a field where there's natural means of watering, and if it grows in the mountains also, it'll be okay. Talmud Lomar, Arvei Nachal mikom makom. From here they learn Arvei Nachal is plural and includes others. To which Abba Shaul Amal, he has a different explanation. Arvei Shtayim, echad lelulav, echad lemikdash. He understands the plural form as teaching. One is the mitzvah of Arava, willow branches that we use in the lulav, which we've been talking about all along. Ve'echad lemikdash, and one is to teach that in the temple, there was a special mitzvah of taking the Arava that they did on all 7 days, which we're going to learn about toward the end of the Masechet or later on. That's what the Arvei Nachal comes to teach, even though the subject of the sentence is the 4 species that we take, but the plural is coming to teach a different halacha entirely about a special mitzvah of Arava, which is not mentioned anywhere in the Torah. According to Abba Shaul, it's mentioned in the verse Arvei Nachal. That's why it's in plural form. The Rabbanan lemikdash minalehu. Well, the rabbis, where do we get it from the mikdash? So they answer, because they say Arvei Nachal isn't coming to include that. So where would we find Arava in the Torah for the mikdash? Hilchata gemira lehu. Oh, it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. To which they say, how do we know this? Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, eser netiot Arava v'nisuch hamayim halacha l'Moshe Sinai. He gives a list of 3 things that are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. You may remember that we had a similar list of 3 things that are halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and the Gemara is actually going to mention them in a minute. Okay, just like we have that. The Gemara is not going to mention it. Rashi is going to mention it. My mistake. I want to read through Rashi. So Rashi is in my head. Okay, so let's go through these 3 things. These 3 things, okay, interestingly, 2 of them are connected to Sukkot. 1 of them is connected to Shemitah, and specifically, we're just past Rosh Chodesh Elul, the first of Elul. We're going to learn a halacha, and this year is the Shemitah year. So we're going to learn a halacha about the 30 days before Shemitah year starts. We have a law called Tosefet Shvi'it. You have to add on to the Shemitah year. On the Shemitah year, you're not allowed to plow or plant or work the land at all. And now we're going to learn that not only that, but 30 days before you're not allowed to. Eser Netiot is a special law where Tosefet Shvi'it does not apply. Okay, it's just like Tosefet Shabbat, and we learned about Tosefet Yom Kippurim and Yoma, about adding on to Shabbat. We make Shabbat last longer, and we started earlier. Likewise, Yom Kippurim and also Shemitah. And Arava and Nisuch Hamayim are both laws that have to do with the temple and Sukkot. So Nisuch Hamayim, Rashi tells us, I'm just going to skip because the Eser Netiot is a little more complicated. We're going to do the Nisuch Hamayim. We'll come back to the Eser Netiot. If you look down at Rashi, much more toward the bottom of the daf, because there's a very long Rashi on this Eser Netiot. Nisuch Hamayim, he says that's water libations. If you remember, with most of the korbanot, especially the korban tamid, for example, they were wine libations. So on Sukkot, there were special water libations. Rashi says not everyone agrees that these were connected litmidin shel shacha, that it was part of the morning tamid service. It was connected with the korban tamid of the morning. Not everybody agrees with it. Yes, you did it every day, but it wasn't necessarily connected with the korban tamid. Anyway, all 7 days of the holiday. So again, these are both two things that happen in the temple every day of Sukkot. Eser Netiot, let's explain. So Rashi has a bunch of interesting points. The first thing Rashi says is, Elu Shlosha, he wants to know, how did these three get here all together in one grouping? So he says, if you think about the fact that we normally talk about, it's very interesting in our generation because we're influenced by the academic world to understand how the Mishnah came about, how the Gemara came about, how things were recorded. But even Rashi was interested in this, and this is an interesting Rashi that shows that. Somebody must have asked about these three things in the Beit Midrash. How did we get to the fact that these are Halach Moshe Sinai? Someone must have asked in the Beit Midrash, how do we know these laws from the Torah? V'hishivu, and they must have been answered, Shalach Moshe Sinai, that they're Halach Moshe Sinai. Who answered that? Well, it must be Rabbi Yochanan, because I'm a Rabbi Asi, I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. And then V'shama HaShomea, the one who heard this, right? That's Rabbi Asi. Ugrasam keseder sheshamam. And then he recited them in the order that he heard them, right? They want to I assume Rashi is getting at, why are these three things put together? It must have been they were asked in the Beit Midrash, they were answered, he heard, and then he put them together in a list. He says it's just like that list we had earlier in the Masechet on Daf Hey of Shiurim, the Chatzitzim, and the Mechitzot. And likewise, anytime you see a list like this, that must be how it happens. It's very interesting that Rashi is explaining to us how these things got together in a list, because if you think about it, there's a whole list of items that are halach l'mosh misina. Why isn't this listed in the same list as the shiurim, chatzitzin, and mechitzin? So what he's saying is it must have been somebody asked about these on a particular occasion, and then whoever heard, right, recited them. Okay, now let's understand what Eser Netiot are. So now he brings us the Masechet Shvi'it, just skipping a few lines. It's a Mishnah, he says. Eser Netiot hamefuzarot b'toch Beit Se'ah. Remember the Beit Se'ah, that's an area of 50 by 50 cubits, about 24 by 24 meters. And so there's 10 small saplings, okay, new trees that were planted. She'ein ben zo lezo ela kama sheyesh ben zo lechaverta. That means they're evenly spaced out, these 10 little saplings within a space. V'tafsu Beit Se'ah, and they took up a space of Beit Se'ah, which is Nunama. They're equally placed within this field. If that's the case, because they're saplings and they really need to be, the land needs to be plowed in order for them to grow. You have all the way until Rosh Hashanah to plow these. Once Rosh Hashanah of the Shemitah year hits, you can no longer plow them because it's Shemitah. So even though you're supposed to add from the Chol onto the Kodesh, meaning the 7th year is sanctified, even the end of the 6th year is supposed to be sanctified, but because of that, there's a special verse, which is many different explanations about whether this is even referring to Shemitah or not. But the verse that says, according to this interpretation, is referring to Shemitah. And why is it telling you this? We already know you can't work the land. So it must be coming to add something additional. What is it? Tosefet, this addition. As it says in Moed Katan, they learned it out from Psukim. B'nitiot ne'emar leMoshe miSinai shemutar lachrosh tachtehem ad Rosh Hashanah kadei shelo yivshu. Because these new saplings, we allow you to do it in order so they don't dry out. Right? You see, there's halacha, and then there's a need. Because there's a need, the rabbis allow this, but only if they're 10 and they're mefuzarot kilchatam b'toch Beit Se'ah. Therefore, according halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that you can plow this entire field. But so when can't you? So I'm skipping a little bit. If there's less than 10, or they're not mefuzarot kilchatan, they're not evenly spaced, then what do? Choresh tachat kol echat ve'echat kshiur yinikata lefi cheshbon. So then you just do around each individual tree. Then you can't do the whole area. Then you have to do under each individual tree You can plow to help that tree, but not the entire area. So this is a special heter, the 10 saplings within a space of 50 by 50, we could do the whole thing. So that and Arava Nisuch HaMayim are all halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Tanu Rabbanan, another braita about Aravot. Arvei Nachal Hagdelot ala Nachal. Pchat l'tzaftzfa Hagdela ben ha'arim. This comes to include the tzaftzfa, which is a type of willow that grows between the mountains. Amar Rabbi Zera. So according to this version, we're going to have two versions of this source. The first version is we have the halacha, that the tzaftzfa is not included. Then Rabbi Zera says, what's the verse for this? And he brings a verse. Kacha mayim rabim tzaftzfa samu. It's a verse where the Jewish people are being reprimanded in Sefer Yechezkel. That God said, I placed you by mayim rabim. That was the intent. And you put yourselves in tzaftzfa, by the tzaftzfa between the mountains. Right? I placed you in a place where there was lots of water. And you moved yourselves to the tzaftzfa. This is a reference to I had a certain intent in mind for the Jewish people, and the Jewish people did what they wanted, and they did something else, right? God plans, and right, it's like we usually say the opposite, right? Man plans and God laughs. But this is saying, no, God planned for us something, and we kind of took it to a totally different place. So it's a very negative verse. And then they say, so Amar le'Abaye, who's to say this is such a negative verse? Dilma perushe kamefarish. Maybe it's explaining. Kachamayim rabim. I placed you by great waters. Umaynihu. And where is that? And what is that? The tzaftzfa. So they say, no, it can't possibly be. That's what it means because in Cain, my samo. Right? It says kachamayim rabim. I placed you on mayim rabim. Tzaftzfa samu. They placed themselves in the tzaftzfa. So it's clear that they went in a different direction. That's a negative verse. Amar Rabbi Avau, and now Rabbi Avau explains this verse the way I already kind of explained it before. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu. God said, Ani amarti sheyu Yisrael lefanai kekach hamayim rabim. I wanted the people to be like I intended, firmly placed on by great waters. Okay, maybe what this means exactly. Maybe reference to Torah learning. We always talk about Torah learning is like the water, right? Or right, I wanted you to be firmly placed in a good place, solid ground. And what happened? But him somewhat, nihu arava. And what is that? What grows al mayim rabim bi arava? Behem somewhat man kitzaf tzefah. So what do you see here? You see two things. Number one, arava is not tzaftzfa. Tzaftzfa is not arava, right? It's almost, they're put here as opposites. Right? This is something totally different. That's how we know that tzaftzfa can't be used. But also, I think it goes back to this idea of mitzvah haba ba'avera. It's not exactly, but this is used in a verse to describe the Jewish people as they went wayward. They're not good people. Therefore, we don't want to use a tzaftzfa, which is used in reference to describing the Jewish people as not having done God's will. Why would we want to use that for a mitzvah? Okay, so that's why. So we have two reasons, really. One is it's clear it's not an arava, and the second is it's clearly looked at as a negative thing here. That's the first version. So the first version, we had a braita. We had Abaye questioned our we have Rabbi Zera who said, where's the verse for this? Abaye questions the use of that verse. Maybe the verse is a positive verse, to which Rabbi Avau says, no, it's a negative verse. But the Gemara had said, because it used the word samu, it's clear it's the Jewish people doing something different than what God planned. Now we're going to have the same thing, but in a bit of a different version. Some people say that the verse itself, is actually part of the braita itself. It's not that Rabbi Zera came and said, what's the verse for this? But it's actually in the braita. Then comes Rabbi Zera, Matkefla Rabbi Zera. He's the one who questions instead of Abaye. Abaye doesn't appear in this version. V'dilma perushe kamefaresh, kachamayim rabim. And maybe you can explain this verse that the tzaftzfa is describing Almayim Rabim. Im came my samo, again, the same question, but again, it's asked on Rabbi Zera instead of being asked on Abaye. And then Rabbi Avau comes in with the answer, just like in the previous. Amar Rabbi Avau, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ani amarti sheYisrael lefanai kekach hamayim rabim, umaynihu arava. So here Abaye explains the verse as we did before. God had one intent and we took it a different way. Okay, so both are really one and the same with a minor variation that the pasuk itself was found in the Braita, which gives it more strength because it was in an earlier source. And Abaye doesn't appear here at all. It's Rabbi Zera. Instead of bringing the verse, he's the one who questions the use of the verse. Tanu Rabbanit, another Braita about Arava. Ezehu Arava ve'ezehu tzaftzfa. How do you know the difference between them? Now, it's true one grows on the water and one grows in the mountains, but still, how would you determine which is which? Arava, also we talked about before that you could have Arava from the mountains. So Arava kaneh shela adom, its stem is red. Ve'aleh shela mashuch, its leaf is long, elongated. Upia chalak, and the edges of it are smooth. Tzaftzfa, the tzaftzfa kaneh shela lavan, its stem is white. Aleh shela agol, the leaves are rounded, not elongated. Upia domeh lemagal, and the edges are like a sickle. Okay, so now a sickle is going to have, it's this rounded thing that we've seen before, right? We talked about the lulav leaning like a sickle, but it's kind of like a semicircle, but in it are teeth, okay? So it's prickly or a little bit, right? There's edges around it. So now they say, the hatanya, but wait, don't we have in a Braita, domeh lemagal kashel, domeh lemasar pasul. If it's like magal, a sickle, then it's okay. But if it's like a masar, it's like a saw. Okay, there's a big debate what the difference between these are. Some talk about them leaning in, they're angled more than straight, or maybe the masar are longer, right? They're more, right? You think about a saw, it's much more severe than a sickle. Okay, so difference, the masar is obviously more protruding in some kind of way, or more harsh, I would say. So if it's like a masar, the edges that they come out very strong, right? Or somehow in that kind of way, pasul, it's disqualified. So if you're going to say that the tzaftzfa has things jutting out like a sickle, it says in a different source, if it juts out like a sickle, it's fine. So now they say, Amar Abaye, kitanya hi bechilfa gila. They were, okay, what's a chilfa gila? It's a type of arava, not a tzaftzfa. The tzaftzfa, even if it's like a sickle, it's a problem because it's a tzaftzfa. We already said it, tzaftzfa is a problem. If it's a chilfa gila, which is a bit of a different variant of the arava, where it, instead of having smooth edges, it has rougher edges, depends how rough they are. If they're rough like a sickle, it's fine. If they're rough like a saw, it's a problem. So there you see, this doesn't contradict at all because it wasn't talking about our topic, which is the tzaftzfa. Now, Amar Abaye, Shma Mina, you can infer from here, Hai Chilfa Gila Kasher Lahoshana. You can infer from here that a Chilfa Gila, which is a type of arava, you can use because the whole point is we just assume that Braita must be talking about a Chilfa Gila, which means it must be okay. To which the Gemara asks, Pshita, isn't that obvious that a Chilfa Gila, it's a type of arava, it's not a tzaftzfa, should be fine, obviously. So they say, well, not so obviously. Ma'u detema hu'il v'it le'shem levai. Lo nitkashel, because it has a descriptor. It's called a chilfa gila. It's not called an arava, a plain arava. It's called a chilfa gila. That has a specific, unique name, and it's not called arve nachal, for example. So you might have thought it's a problem. Kamash malan, as we saw before with the hadas mitzra'ah, remember the Egyptian myrtle branch? Since the Torah doesn't exactly say the word hadas, here it does use arve, but it does use arava, but it's really saying any kind of willow that grows by the river, by the brook. So therefore, it should be fine no matter what it is, really. So therefore, chilfa gila will be included because, again, we don't have an exact word. It says just this and nothing else. So because of that, we'll allow just modifiers without a problem. Unless, again, it's the tzaftzfa, which we already determined is problematic. Ve'ema hachanami, well, maybe really chilfa gila isn't good because it has a shem levaya modifier. No, because it said arvei nachal, as I said a minute ago, which comes to include all kinds of arava, it's fine. Now we're going to talk about, okay, we mentioned the other day about this whole thing about Rabbi Eliezer being in this time period where we crossed from, right, he was in the time of the destruction of the temple. And in the wake of the Churban, he was the student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who basically did this whole reformation in the temple. And his whole idea, right, is that the sukkah has to be very formalized 14 meals a day, again, before he changes his mind, if he really changed his mind. And we have, if you remember there, I'll actually remind you of this because it's relevant to later in the daf, that there we had a question on his 14 meals and came Bira'ah, the name of Rabbi Asi, I believe it was, Rabbi Ami, I think it was. We'll see later. It comes up in today's daf again, that he gives the same kind of answer. That actually it's in tomorrow's daf. Sorry for my confusion. No, it's in today's daf. Chazarbo, okay, he says he changed his mind. He actually didn't require any more 14 meals, but ideally in the beginning, he required 14 meals. He required that you don't move from your own sukkah. You have to build it all before the holiday. His whole approach was, we have to prepare in advance for this holiday, just like the temple. And everything in the temple had a place, everything had a time, everything was very organized. And organized, right, which is very different from the way we have our own houses. Our own houses, right, some of us maybe are more organized and more planned out. Some of us are less planned out. So, and house doesn't need super duper planning in advance. But the temple, everything had a place, everything had a time. Remember in Pesachim, there's a whole timeline when you do which korban at what hour, who does which. We had all the payas, the lotteries, whose job is it to do what. Everything is organized. Likewise, Rabbi Eliezer thought on Sukkot, everything has to be very formalized, organized, and prepared in advance. His approach was to make the temple like, right, to make your sukkah like a temple. And that's why there's all these references throughout the Masechet, if you notice, we keep talking about them, to temple items. Okay, we're going to see more of it. It's all throughout, right? We started with the measurements of the sukkah, 20 cubits, 10 tefachim, all coming from learning from the temple, etc. So now we're going to, and this is all in the wake of the destruction. Now, in the end, we don't hold like Rabbi Eliezer. And why is that? Because the rabbi's opinion prevailed. And the rabbis said, listen, after post-temple times, things need to change. Okay, we can't, post-temple times are not the same as pre-temple times. There's different needs. That you don't need everyone to have their own temple in their house. That's not the idea. The idea is, right, maybe to sanctify your regular life, to find ways to bring God into your regular life, but without the superstructure of the temple. In the temple, you needed all that. Outside the temple, you don't necessarily need all that. Like they said, ibai achil, ibai lo achil. You want to eat, great, eat. You don't want to eat, no problem. This is your own house. You get to decide what you want to do. You want to go to your friend's sukkah, no problem. It's a different, right? Something different is needed. Likewise here, he says, there's another thing that comes up here that Rav Chisda says, after the temple, things change, right? There was a new reality. Here we're going to talk purely on a linguistic level, but I think it's the same idea getting across, that things change. So now he tells us something very important, which is, Hanetzlat Mile. Again, we have this threesome. We keep having threesomes today. These three things, Ishtene Shamayim Charev Beit HaMikdash. Once the temple was destroyed, the names of these items changed. And it wasn't just, right, the environment changed, the needs changed, even what we call things changed. Now, this you really have to know. We'll see in a minute why. Chalfata, Aravta, Aravta, Chalfata. The first name change is that Chalfata, which that Rashi says is the Tzaftzfa, is now called Arava. And Arava is now called Chalfata. That means that if you see something called a tzaftzfa now, which they call chalfata, it's actually an arava. And that's the one that you use on the holiday. And if you see something called arava, that's actually tzaftzfa, okay? The chalfata. That's very confusing, right? So l'may nafkamina, what's the relevance? Lulav, you have to know which one to put in your lulav. You're actually looking nowadays for what's called tzaftzfa and not for what's called arava. Obviously, nowadays it's all changed back to the original. But what they're saying is what the average person on the street calls chalfata, that's actually a rava. And what people call a rava is actually no good. This could create a lot of confusion. Next one, shipura chatzotzrata, chatzotzrata shipura. What we call a shofar is now called a chatzotzra, a trumpet. When they use the word trumpet, what they really mean, what's the difference between a trumpet and a shofar? Shofar is bent and a trumpet is straight. So what they call a shofar is now what they called before in the time before the destruction, is now called a chatzotzra. And what they call the chatzotzra is now called a shofar. My nafkamina, obviously, l'shofar shel Rosh Hashanah. You have to know which one to use for Rosh Hashanah. It's now called a chatzotzra and not a shofar. The third one, patorta, patora, patora, patorta, l'may nafkamina, l'mekach umemkar. This is a totally different thing. This is a table. There's a small table and a large table. And what's the difference? Well, once they called Patorah one, and now they call it Patorta, and what was once Patorta is now Patorah. If you go to order a table and you want to order, let's say, a kitchen table, and instead you get a desk, right, which is not the same size and not the same shape, right? You go on Amazon and you order, and it said no image, and it didn't give you the dimensions, and you ordered it anyway, thinking it was a kitchen table. And imagine you get a desk, a desk. You don't want a desk, you wanted a kitchen table. So if you have to know the lingo, let's say that after the destruction, they started calling desks kitchen tables, and they started calling kitchen tables desks. So if you ordered a kitchen table and you claimed, but I really wanted a kitchen table and I ended up with a desk, Amazon can claim, but you're not with the program. The names change. Everybody now calls desks kitchen tables and kitchen tables desks. And you're wrong. That's not what you ordered. Okay. And they could claim, no, you can't return it. Okay. So that's the relevance for that. Amar Abai. So those were the three. But now Abai is going to add one, and Rava is going to add another one. So the stomach of the animals kosher animals who chew their cuds have 4 stomachs. So now there's different laws about a needle that penetrates one side or 2 sides of the stomach. One stomach has a thicker outer layer, and therefore if you penetrate one side, it's not a problem. But the one that has a thinner layer, if you penetrate one side, that's the first stomach. If you penetrate one side, it's already a problem because it's very thin. In the middle stomach, the second one, only if the needle penetrates both sides, is it called a treifa. This is laws of treifa. We're actually going to get into this a little more later in 2 more dapim about treifas, because they're going to connect between disqualifications in etrogim and treifas. Again, an interesting connection to sacrifices, because treifa also was no good for a sacrifice. So they say what we call bekase, which is the second compartment, where only if you put a needle through both sides, they're going to be disqualified. They now call huvlila, okay, which was the first stomach in the before destruction. Huvlila bekase, and what they call huvlila now we call bekase. So again, l'mayin afkamina, what's the relevance? L'machat hanimtza ba'ovi beit hakosot, for a needle that's found. If you slaughter an animal and you find a needle inside the lining of the beit hakosot, so you have to know, is it stomach number 1 or is it stomach number 2? So Amar Rava, next one, Bar Yosef. Rava Bar Yosef says, Afani Omer Bavel Borsif Bavel. Another connection, another words that people confuse, that people now change the wording of. Bavel is now called Borsif, and Borsif is what's Borsif was once Borsif, now it's Bavel. L'mayin nafkamina, what's the relevance of this? Ligitei nashim. Okay, so what does this have to do with it? An interesting machloka between the commentaries. Rashi says, if you learn Masechet Gitin, and we'll learn soon, we're going to get to a whole, the beginning of Masechet Gitin is all about if you bring a get from outside of Israel to Israel, you have to say, B'fanai nechtav v'fanai nechtam. It was written before me and it was signed before me. 2 possible reasons. Rava have a debate. Is it because since they came from far away, we have to have the signatures verified, because we won't be able to, if there's a problem later on, since it came from far away, we won't be able to verify the signatures? Or is it because in Lishma, outside of Israel, they don't understand the laws very well because they're not in the center of Judaism? Again, at the time of the Mishnah, that was the center. And they're not Beki'in Lishma. They don't know the law that a get has to be written specifically for this person, for these 2 people getting divorced. For example, that means if you find a get thrown in the garbage that was never used, and it happens to have your name and the name of your husband, you can't decide, I'll take this get and I'll use it, because it has to be written specifically for the name of those people. So now, then the Gemara says that, well, Bavel is like Israel for all these issues, because Bavel you don't have to worry about Edim L'Kaimo, because people go back and forth all the time, okay? There's people who are constantly going between Bavel and Israel, and therefore you can always find people to ratify the signatures. And number 2, it's people who will know the people who it was brought from. And number 2, they know the laws of Lishma, because now all the yeshivas are in Bavel. So now you have to know, is it Bavel or is it Borsif? If it was brought from Borsif, well, Borsif is actually really Bavel. And if it was brought from Bavel, it's actually not Bavel, it's really Borsif. That's one option. Another is, as we said, it has to be lishma. You also have to be very careful to write the names of where the people are getting divorced. You have to write it very carefully and know exactly. Let's say you have a get and it says they were divorced in X place, and it turns out they weren't divorced in that place. The get is invalid. So let's say it said they were divorced in Bavel, but it was really Borsif. So again, if Borsif is really Bavel, then that would explain it, right? So you'd have to know, or also just to know which name you're supposed to write in the get. Right? This happens all the time in ketubas, but ketubas, it's less critical than it is in, it's also important, but it's less critical than it is in the divorce document. And there, you really have to, there even they write names and other potential names that city could be called by. So also there, it's very important to know what's the name of the city or what are other possible names of the city. So that's a different explanation. Rashi doesn't bring this, but others bring it. New Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Now we're going to get to how many hadassim and aravot do you need. In Daf Mishalahem this week, they talk about Temani minhag, a Yemenite minhag, about how many they put in each lulav. You can listen and hear about different minhagim that you might not know about. But Rabbi Yishmael says, right, we all know how many goes in the average lulav. Shlosha hadassim, 3 hadassim, shte aravot, 2 aravot, lulav echad ve'etrog echad. Right, so 3 hadassim, 2 aravot, 1 lulav, 1 etrog. That's what we put in ours. Afilu shnayim ktumim ve'echad eno katum. He says, by the way, though, even if 2 are cut off and 1 is not of the hadas, even though we saw before, katum is pasul. He says, if 2 are ktumim and 1 is not, it's okay. We're going to have to understand on what basis is this okay. Either katum is a problem. There's a debate whether this is the same katum as we talked about before. Maybe it's not cut off. We had before niktam rosho, the top of it. Some of the Mefarshim think this is niktam rosho. Some people think maybe it's cut off. They fall off in other places of the lulav. So there's a debate about that. But in any case, we're going to have to figure out, why does he think 2 could be cut off and 1 not? It seems weird. So the Gemara will ask that question and we'll answer it. Rabbi Tarfon omer, afilu shlosham ktumim. Rabbi Tarfon says you can even have 3 that are cut. He doesn't seem to think that's a problem. Again, likely you would have to say this is somewhat different from the previous Mishnah, or maybe he disagrees with it. Rabbi Akiva omer, kashem shalulav echad ve'etrog echad, kach hadas echad ve'arava echad. He has an interesting opinion. Again, we learned that what you think of this holiday and what you're so used to sometimes isn't actually the case. He says, 1 lulav, 1 etrog, 1, right? Just like you only need 1 lulav and 1 etrog, likewise, you only need 1 hadas and 1 arava. So let's start with the Gemara. Tanya. Well, first, we're going to bring another braita about this, where we have, right, style of midrash halacha, where we darshan, where we get these opinions from the verses. Rabbi Yishmael omer, pri etz hadar. That sounds like echad, right? You need a fruit, 1. Kapot marim echad. We already learned that that's 1, even though kapot sounds like plural, but it's written without a vav. Because it's written without a vav, we learned it's kapat marim. It's as if it's one lulav and not more. Anath etz avot shlosha. Okay, now this is weird. How do you get to 3? Rashi says it says anath, it says etz, and it says avot. It's 3 words. That gets you to 3. Tosfot questions that and says, what about pre-eitz hadar? That's also 3. Tosfot has a bit of a question. Again, maybe you'll just say, this is the kind of drasha that they knew it was 3 and they wanted to connect it to a verse. It's not really that they derived it from there. Arvei nachal shtayim, that's because it's plural. Va'afilu, now we get to the second part of Rabbi Yishmael. Afilu shnayim ktumim ve'echad she'eno katum, back to the hadas, even if 2 are cut off and 1 is not, it's okay. Rabbi Tarfon omer shlosha va'afilu shloshtam ktumim. This is just a repeat of what it says in our Mishnah, right? This is the Braita has a pasuk for Rabbi Yishmael, but the others are just written as is. Rabbi Akiva omer kashem shalulav echad etrog echad kach hadas echad v'arava echad. He says the same thing he said in the Mishnah. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Now, there's different versions here, and you'll see that some versions make more sense than the other. To say Amar lo, it sounds like Rabbi Eliezer is talking straight to Rabbi Akiva, but you'll see that what he says doesn't really relate only to Rabbi Akiva, and therefore the version that says Amar Rabbi Eliezer sounds almost like Rabbi Eliezer is talking to whoever, all the other opinions, and he says the following. Right? You would think that maybe the etrog should be together with all the others. Amalt, so then he says, but we would say, 1 second, Amart, if you ask that question, you could say Now he's going to notice something grammatical in the pasuk. It says, take on the first day, pri etz hadar, kapot marim, those two are listed without a vav in between them. Then it says, ve'anaf etz avot, ve'arvei nachal, and those. Because there's a vav connecting the last three, he says that shows those three need to be together, but the etrog doesn't need to be bound with the others. So he says, kapot. It just says kapot. It doesn't say vikapot. So because there's no vav connecting the two, clearly they don't need to be brought together. But how do you know that without one, you can't do the other three? You need all four to fulfill the mitzvah. Talmud lomar ulekachtem. How do they darshan ulekachtem? The last two words of ulekachtem are, right, and you should take for yourself, right? Lekachtem lachem. Lekachtem is you should take. The tough mem at the end. But they darshan the tough mem, shetehe lekichat tama. It has to be lekach tam, tama, a complete taking. And if you don't have them all, it's not complete. Now the question is, what does it mean that they're ma'agvin zeh et zeh? Does it mean they all have to be taken together at the same time or not? Let's go back to this interesting machloket we had about does lulav need eged or not? Does the lulav need to be bound? We already learned that only according to Rabbi Yehuda it needs to be bound. According to the rabbis, it doesn't need to be bound. Why do we bind it? Well, because even the rabbis said it's a mitzvah. It's nicer. It looks prettier. Ze'eli vanve. We want to beautify God. So therefore, there's a very interesting machloket in Tosfot. If you look at this Tosfot, if you look further down in Tosfot, it says halfway through, uperesh b'halachot gedolo. The Bahag, which is the commentary from the time of the Gaonim, said, Ein ma'akvin. What does it mean, ein ma'akvin? Delo tema, don't think ad magbel hu bahade adadi, that you have to actually hold them all at the same time, which is obviously what we do. You don't actually have to. If you pick up one, and then you pick up the other, and then you pick up, right? Let's say you make the bracha al netilat lulav, and then you pick up an etrog, you pick up a lulav, you pick up a hadassim, and then you pick up the aravot, all separate, no problem, he says. But he says, right, the kamal lulav ein tzarich eged. He said, look, it says it doesn't need to be bound. That must mean that you can even take one after the other. But Tosfot says, this is a very strange thing to say this, what the Bahag says. Since it's all one mitzvah, how could you possibly fulfill this by one after the other? And therefore, he says, Rabbeinu Tamigia b'sifro, he changed it a little, lo tema de ma'ak mishum tama. He has a different version here. He says, don't think it's ma'akev mishum tama, ela she'en lo. In other words, when it says ma'akvin, it doesn't mean, right? It's ela she'en lo, that you don't have. But aval yesh lo tamahu afa pi shelo chibro be'ogdo. As long as you have them all, it's not ma'akev, even if you didn't bind them. But he says, it's as long as you didn't bind them, but they still have to obviously be taken together because it's one mitzvah. One mitzvah has to be fulfilled all at one moment. So it's an interesting debate about this perception of how to take a lulav. Can it be taken one after the other, all the different species, or not? Okay, moving on. The Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yishmael, either which way, it doesn't really make any sense. If you need them to be complete and whole, then all three of them should be. And if you don't need them to be complete, then even one, right? You don't need to be. In other words, you don't even need one. It could be all three, like Rabbi Tarfon said. So Amar Bi'a'a, Amar Rabbi Ami, here's where I quoted before. The same person said, when addressed with a question, okay, Chazer bo Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, I think we said it there. Just like we said when Chazer bo Rabbi Eliezer, we don't really know if Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind. But basically, when he gets stuck in a corner and something doesn't make sense, he assumes, he must have changed his mind. Okay, what did he change his mind about? So in the beginning, he thought you need 3 hadassim, and it seems like he changed his mind and you really only need 1 hadas, and it needs to be complete because of hadar. Okay, that's the assumption they make now of Rabbi Yishmael, which is interesting because Rabbi Yishmael seemed the closest to what we hold, but it seems not. I guess Rabbi Tarfon is the one who says even 3 k'tumim is okay, and he still thinks you need 3. And in fact, we'll see why this is the halacha, because Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, halacha ke Rabbi Tarfon. He said we hold like Rabbi Tarfon. Now we're going to try to prove, how do we know that this is in fact true? Not just because Rabbi Yehuda told us this, but we're going to see something Shmuel did, very interesting, and it connects with something we saw him do in Pesachim Pesachim. Shmuel goes according to his own approach. He went to the people who were selling hadassim. We all know that comes Sukkot, right? You want to buy a hadass during the year, it won't cost you very much. But if you want to buy it before Sukkot, it's outrageously priced. Spend a lot of money. He said to the people who were selling them, Ashvu uzvine, lower your prices and sell them for a lower price. And if not, if you don't lower your prices, I'm going to teach everyone that the halacha is like Rabbi Tarfon, and they can even be torn, right? Fallen, the leaves could be fallen off. It's not a problem. And that will basically lower your prices because there'll be a lot more hadassim out there that people can buy, right? This is Shmuel. If you remember, he did the same thing when it came to pots around Pesach time. I forget all the details, but there was a case there where he threatened them and he said, if you don't, right? They were trying to have people all buy new pots, and they raised the prices of them. So they said they had to buy new pots. And he said, I'm going to teach the halacha that people don't really have to if you don't lower your prices, right? Shmuel seemed to be very concerned for, keeping prices at a competitive price and not have people take advantage of, especially when it comes to mitzvah, that their mitzvah wouldn't have to require them to spend all this money. So it's interesting, he did this also in this situation. So now they say, how does this prove that he held like Rabbi Tarfon? My time, why did he say, I'm going to teach like Rabbi Tarfon? If it's just because he was the most lenient, well, he's not the most lenient. Who's the most lenient? The leaders look at Rabbi Akiva to make Tfei. Rabbi Akiva is even more mekel because he says you only need one, right? Rabbi Tarfon says you need three, but they can all be damaged. Rabbi Akiva says you only need one. So obviously it must be because he held like Rabbi Tarfon and not because he just wanted to say, I'm going to teach the most lenient thing. If it was just the most lenient, he would have picked Rabbi Akiva. So now they say, what are you talking about? That's not a good proof. Rabbi Akiva said only one, but the one had to be perfect. It's harder to find one perfect one than it is to find three damaged ones. So therefore, actually, Rabbi Tarfon was the most lenient, and therefore it's not clear from this story that he actually held like Rabbi Tarfon. He was just threatening them that I will teach it like Rabbi Tarfon because that's the most lenient of all. Still, we have Rav Yehuda who says in the name of Shmuel that he held like Rabbi Tarfon. Okay, now we're moving on to the etrog. Etrog hagazul v'hayavesh pasul, a stolen lulav, a dry lulav. You're already getting this. We've had it already with all the others. We're finally on the last one. Shel Asher, right? Interestingly, they end with etrog, even though, like we said, the pasuk started with etrog, probably because they want to start with the lulav, which is the base. It holds the hadassim and the aravot, and then it moves on to the etrog, which is carried next to it. Again, it's focusing more on not the importance of which one's more important, but the actual, right? Normally you start with your etrog and then you add your lulav because your etrog needs to be set up, kind of like in Pesach where we started chronologically with where you go, or Yoma also. Etrog hagazul v'hayavesh pasul shel Asherah v'shel ir hanidachat pasul. Again, the Asherah and ir hanidachat, then from a city where they all worship Avodah Zarah, it's disqualified. Shel orla. Okay, this is a tree. Within its first 3 years, you can't eat the fruits. It's a debate whether this is only in Israel, outside of Israel. Even outside of Israel, there's an issue. Question is it d'oraita or not? How much does it apply in the exact same way or not? But there is a concept of orla also in Chutz La'aretz. The first 3 years, you can't eat your fruit. So it's fruit from the first 3 years of a tree, from an etrog tree, you can't use it. Shel truma tme'ah pasul. If it's truma that became impure, which you can't eat, but you can burn, you can use it for burning things, that's also disqualified. We're going to get in detail in the Gemara in tomorrow's daf about all these things. Shel truma tehora lo yitov im natal kasher. If it's pure truma, good truma, which can only be eaten by a kohen, you can't use it for your etrog. But if you did, it's okay. Again, the Gemara is going to get into all this. Why is it not okay? Milachatchila, as we say, but b'diavad, if you did it, it is. Shel demai, if it's safek, whether someone took truma to maasrot from it or not. Beit Shammai poslimu, Beit Hillel machshirim. Beit Hillel says it's fine. Beit Shammai says it's no good. Okay, again, we're going to have to wait in suspense for all these cases because we don't really know why. Maser sheni b'Yerushalayim. The maser sheni, this is the second tithe after you give to the 10th of your produce to the Levi, in years 1, 2, 4, and 5, you bring a tenth to the Jerusalem and you eat it there, or you redeem it onto money and you bring the money there and buy stuff. Lo yitol, again, don't use this in etrog of Maser Sheni, but im natal kasher, but if you did, it's okay. Al tachazazit al rubo, if you have a boil-like thing, like a bubble, on the majority of it, or nitla pitmato, or the pitom came out, right? That's the top part, although we'll see in the Gemara. Niklaf, if it gets peeled, nistak, a crack in it, which a crack seems to be along the length of it. Nikev, it got a hole. The chaser kolshu pasul, and not only did you poke a hole in it, but it took out part of the etrog, it's disqualified. Al tachazazit al miuto, if only the chazazit came, the bubble, the boil-like thing, was only on part of it, on minority of it, or natal oktso, if the bottom part came out and not the pitom, or you had a hole in it, but it didn't take out anything of the etrog, right? Sometimes you put a hole in your shirt, like you put a pin through, it doesn't take really any part of your shirt out. Or then it's kasher. Etrog kushi. Okay, we'll see what that is, but it seems to be a blackened etrog. Hayarok kikarte, green like a leek. Rabbi Meir machshir, Rabbi Yehuda posel. Okay, a kushi is no good. A yarok, if it's like a leek, a green one, Rabbi Meir says no problem. Rabbi Yehuda disqualifies. We saw this before because it's not ripe enough. Shiur etrog katan. What's the smallest shiur for an etrog? Rabbi Meir omer ke'egos, like a walnut. Rabbi Yehuda omer ke'beitza. It has to be big like an egg, because even though that's not so big for an etrog, but otherwise it's really unripe. Ubigadol, and how big? Kadesh yochash nine biado achat, hold two in one hand. Rabbi Yossi omer afilu echad b'shtei adav, even one in two hands is okay. We saw that before. What the debate was, I'm not going to review it now. With that, we'll finish for today, and we'll get into all these cases in tomorrow's daf. Have a great day.